Okay, so we're going to look at Act 5, Scene 2 today. This is where everyone is about to start going to war with Macbeth, and you'll notice that we've got Menteith, Caithness, Angus, Lennox, and the soldiers. Malcolm is with his uncle Seward and the good Macduff. So if you remember, this is a really crucial scene because they're about to march on Dunsinane Castle, but the witches actually told Macbeth that really, really misleading prophecy of you can never be defeated until Birnam Wood comes to Dunsinane, as in the wood has to march on the castle, so the trees. Now obviously that sounds insane, that sounds impossible, and that's where we see the witches giving Macbeth's purposefully misleading prophecies. So we'll remember a few of the prophecies, won't we? We'll remember the fact that, and I've already given you the spoiler here, that Macduff, they say beware Macduff, but then they say no man born of woman can hurt you. And then obviously we find out that Macduff was born by caesarean section. So it is all incredibly misleading information in the prophecies. And this is an important part because obviously we remember back to Banquo at the beginning, who said to win us to our harm, the instruments of darkness tell us truths. So you can tell someone the truth, but it doesn't mean that the truth that you are telling them is necessarily good or good for them. Okay, so here we see them marching through Dunsinane. Now, Menteith uses the metaphor revenges burn in them. Make sure you've read this scene before you see me talking through it, even if you don't quite understand it, because there will be things that you remember. Oh, I read that, I know where that is, I can find that. Because I will be skipping parts. So he talks about revenges burn in them, and that metaphor is really important. When we think about fire, we often think about passion. And that's what it's saying here, that they're getting revenge. Now, Macduff is getting revenge for his family, and Malcolm is getting revenge for his father, who's the rightful king. And we remember that Macbeth committed regicide, and we know regicide was incredibly frowned upon. I mean, it still is now, but it was even worse because it was seen as against God. Because remember, the divine right of kings, gods were put there for a reason. So the fact that revenges are burning in them, it really shows us just how motivated these men are. And he talks about, for their dear causes would to the bleeding and the grim alarm excite the mortified man. So even the dead would come back to life to fight for the horrendous things they need to fight for, so the horrendous injustices they've suffered. And then Angus then says, near Birnam Wood shall we well meet them. Now, what's interesting there is that he talks about Birnam Wood here. So as the audience, obviously there's a bit of dramatic irony here, because we know when something happens at Birnam Wood, that's when Macbeth will finally be defeated. And obviously Macbeth thinks that that's impossible, but we've seen moments where the witches' prophecies have been very misleading for Macbeth. And Caithness says, who knows if Donalbain be with his brother? Lennox, for certain, sir, he is not. I have a file of all the gentry. There is Seward's son, and many unrough youths that even now protest their first of manhood. So what that means is that they're finally showing that they're men. Now, remember this whole play, we've associated men and masculinity with action, and we've associated it with fighting and power. So again here we're seeing all these young men proving themselves to be very, very manly in the Jacobean era. But actually what Shakespeare is showing as well is a contrast, because we have to remember that Macbeth wasn't necessarily the manliest person, and obviously Lady Macbeth points that out to him quite a lot. So what we see here is Lennox sort of talking about all these young men who are here to prove that they are men. And obviously Macbeth through the whole play is always trying to prove that he's very masculine. So we want to write that down. You know, this play is all about men trying to prove that they're masculine in some respects. And then Menteith calls him a tyrant, which again is really interesting, because this word is starting to, the repetition is starting to be used, because this word has been used a couple of times already and it's being used more. And they talk about the fact that the Dunsinane Castle has been strongly fortified, which basically means it's almost impenetrable. it's going to be very, very difficult for them to actually break through. It's turned into a fort. Now, some say he's mad. Others that lesser hate him do call it valiant fury, so brave anger. Now, what that's showing us here is that no one really around Macbeth is necessarily very keen on him. So they say those who lesser hate him. So if you look at that adjective lesser, if you were to zoom in on that, you wouldn't necessarily say that lesser hate. You know, when it comes to a monarch, a lot of the time there was blind devotion to the monarch because of the divine right of kings. So you would say those that love him, but they don't say that. They say that those that lesser hate him, meaning that everyone at this moment in time actually dislikes Macbeth, but some of them obviously dislike him more than others. And we've got that idea that they're doubting him, they think he's gone mad, and also the fact that they're saying valiant fury, basically meaning that, you know, everything he does is even if they don't hate him as much, they still know that he's driven by anger. But for certain he cannot buckle his distempered cause within the belt of rule. So if you think about buckling a belt, it means like sort of closing it, so it can enclose something, it can control something, which would be like, you know, your trousers, for example. It keeps them up. He cannot buckle his distempered cause, meaning that he can't actually get any control over what's going on. So Macbeth is desperately trying to control things, but it's almost like he can't quite make that connection. Like you connect two ends of a buckle, he can't connect those things. And again, it kind of adds to the fact that, you know, his madness, and as a ruler he's quite inept. So I really like that metaphor as well, just to show that Macbeth isn't a worthy king. He isn't able to do anything. Now, that'll come back at the end when we think about the order that Malcolm brings, because when Malcolm does become king at the end, we think about all the order that brings to the play. So again, spoiler, but I hope you've read ahead by this point. Now, Angus also talks about the secret murders sticking on Macbeth's hands. Now, I find that really interesting because it's another reference to the symbol of the bloody hands. And when they're talking about the bloody hands, the whole point here is that they symbolise guilt, don't they? That's what they symbolise. And what they're sort of trying to say is that now minutely revolts, upbraid, his faith breach. Those he commands move only in command, nothing in love. So knowing that he's this murderer, the secret murderer, knowing he's this tyrant, they move or they fight because they are being told to fight, not because they want to fight for him. So remember, Malcolm was able to go to a different country, and he was able to raise an army in that different country to fight for him, which means that Malcolm is the type of monarch that you want to fight for. However, Macbeth only has people fighting for him because they feel like they have to fight for him, and I think that's really interesting as well. And he also talks about he uses a simile next. Now does he feel his title hang loose about him like a giant's robes upon a dwarfish thief. So we're going to zoom in on that simile a little bit here. So the first thing is he talks about his clothes hanging loosely upon him. Now, clothes at the time were very symbolic of status, and to talk about them hanging loosely, it also shows that his status doesn't fit him, again, because he's not the next in line according to the divine right of kings. But then the next part is the giant's robe, so on a dwarfish thief. Now, obviously not in this day and age, but at the time, people who were short in stature were considered they were considered lesser. They weren't as respected, and size here was brought into it to sort of show that Macbeth isn't able to prove himself worthy, because they wouldn't see them as worthy. Now, obviously, we know that's wrong now, but obviously at the time, that's not what they thought. So it's quite interesting that they talk about, they call him a dwarfish thief, meaning that he stole something that was far too big for him. He stole more status than he deserved. So I want you to write that down for that simile, because it's a really, really good simile to sort of look at if they ever ask you about status or power in Macbeth. Then Menteith actually says, well, why are we shocked that he's gone mad when, within all that is within him does condemn itself for being there, meaning that everything within him doesn't belong there, and it's taking it out on his sanity, because nothing belongs with Macbeth. He's a freak, he's strange, and so what he's saying there is, I'm not surprised he's gone mad, because he's so sort of at war with himself. Now, Caithness, also talks about to give obedience where 'tis truly owed. So we'll march on because we owe Malcolm our obedience, because he is the next in line according to the divine right of kings. He's chosen by God. So we will keep marching because we march for Malcolm. So again, we're seeing that contrast there. They're marching for Malcolm. They're obedient to Malcolm because they believe they truly owe Malcolm their obedience. Whereas, again, we're seeing that contrast. Macbeth's soldiers aren't doing that. Macbeth's soldiers are fighting because they're being told to fight. That's it. So there's no love with Macbeth. Macbeth doesn't command love. He's not a good leader. Meet we the medicine of the sickly weal, and with him pour we in our country's purge each drop of us. So what we'll do is we will give all of our blood just to make this country safe again. So again, they're fighting out of the love for their country, the loyalty that they owe Malcolm, and you know who's going to win in that situation, don't you? And that's what Shakespeare's trying to sort of foreshadow here. We know that that side is going to win, because if you're fighting for a cause, you're more likely to want to fight properly. And that's not what's happening with Macbeth, is it? So Lennox says, he talks about the sovereign flower. So this is a metaphor here. A sovereign is a monarch. So he says to dew the sovereign flower. Dew is the water that you often, if you were to walk outside in the morning and you feel the grass and it's a little bit wet, that's dew. That's what you would say the dew of the morning is. So when they say to dew the sovereign flower, it's them saying that they're going to water it, which basically means they're going to support Malcolm. They're going to let him grow into a good king, as you would a plant, and drown the weeds, meaning that, you know, they're going, they're willing to compare Macbeth to a weed, which basically means he's unwanted, he doesn't belong there, and these are all ideas that will link him to the, you know, not being the rightful king. So there is a metaphor there, and there's a really good metaphor for you to remember as well if they ask you about kings and power, etc., etc. And then they say we march towards Burnham. That's where we're going. Now again, we're going to see whether Burnham Wood marches on Dunsinane, and I think that's really, really interesting here, because it does prove to us that the witches' prophecies are deliberately misleading Macbeth. So at the beginning, when he was told not to trust the witches, and he trusted the witches, we're starting to see where Macbeth's downfall was caused by himself. You know, he didn't have to think about the witches. He didn't have to trust the witches. He could have been like Banquo. He could have forgotten the witches. But he didn't. He was tempted. And even though Banquo gave him some really good advice and told him don't trust them, he still trusted them. And therein lied the issue. Okay? So we'll stop there, and we will go on to Act 5, Scene 3 next. If you are in school, or if you know anyone in school today, can you just make sure that you've told them that they need to find the link to this video and annotate? It's only 15 minutes long, and then they don't have to do the classwork if they've been in school today, but can they just watch these videos to annotate?